Good morning, distinguished guests. Welcome to the second day of East Asia Disability Studies Forum. I am Deputy Secretary General of the Taiwan Society for Disability. Today we're using a different interpretation devices. A few announcements. First of all, please put the interpretation devices on the table with the front on. Don't use any objects to cover the interpretation devices to ensure the signals are smooth. Also, please don't turn the volume too high. For the first agenda, our keynote speaker is Rosemary Kias. Professor Kias is the Commissioner of Australian National Human Rights Commission and also the Vice Chair of UN Commission on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We're very honored to have a Commissioner of National Human Rights Commission Wang Rongzhang as the moderator. Commissioner Wang Rongzhang served as the legislator and also Secretary General for the League of Persons with Disabilities and Commissioner of the Pension Reform at the Presidential Office, and Social Promotion, Welfare Promotion Commissioner, and also Human Rights Consultation Committee under the Executive Yuan, also the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Promotion Committee under the Control Yuan, and also the member of the Committee for the Protection of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and member of Public Welfare Lottery Supervisory Committee under the Ministry of Finance. Let's invite moderator Commissioner Wang. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, organizer, for inviting me as the moderator for this keynote speech. I also like to thank the introduction of the MC. This April, me along with the delegation from the National Human Rights Commission visited the Australia and to visit their Australian Human Rights Commission. After 1 week, I once again accompany the League for Persons with Disabilities and their team and visited Commissioner Rosemary Kias. In both of our visits, I was warmly welcomed by Rosemary Kias, and we talked a lot about the promotion of the work on the National Human Rights Commissions and the implementations of CRPD. During the visit, Secretary General Hong Xinping also invited Rosemary Kias to join our forum. And she also very kindly said yes and agreed so. Unfortunately, because of force majeure, she would not be able to be here with us, but she will share with us with a video and gave her keynote speech. But rest assured, after we played the video, Commissioner Rosemary Kias would also join us online and continue the discussion with us. So if you have any questions for Commissioner Kias, please prepare your questions because we do have a Q&A session afterwards. Well, I think Commissioner Kias needs no further reductions. Many of us involved in the rights of persons with disabilities know her very well. But I just want to briefly say that she actually served as the vice chair and now is, she served as the chair and now is the vice chair of UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And these committee members were actually nominated by state signatories. And so Kias was nominated and elected as the chair, and on her second term, she continues to serve as the vice chair. So that's why she has extensive experience in all the state reports. And I think you all know that in 2002, on August 1st, we had the first in 2022, we had the second state report and international review on CRPD. Actually, on August in the same year, under the 27th CRPD committee, it also reviewed the state report in Japan, China, and South Korea. So I think it's a very timely occasion where the majority of all of our members here were reviewed in 2022. Unfortunately, Taiwan would not be able to join the state report review as a signatory and receive the official review. But for the second, on the second point, with the information prepared by Commissioner KS, Commissioner KS at the same time is also the Royal Committee member of the consultations of the violence and abuse and negligence and exploitations of persons with disabilities in Australia. So it was established, and now the final report in 2019, and the final report was published in 2023. Over 8 million witnesses participated the hearings and provided over 200 suggestions to the committee members. During this period, it also commissioned scholars to conduct thematic research, one of which is regarding the history of the disability movement and also the background and context of CRPD globally. And for that part, it was drafted by Commissioner KS. Commissioner KS was also awarded as the Human Rights Award in Australia. She was the winner in 2022, and this was to actually commemorated the great contributions she has devoted to CRPD. She not only participated in the drafting of CRPD, she also lobbied and persuaded the Congress of Australia to ratify the convention. For today's topic, it is the promise of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Rosemary Karras would be the perfect person to give such keynote speech. So a round of applause for Commissioner Rosemary Karras. Now a round of applause for the keynote speech. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I'd like to thank the organisers of this event for inviting me to present this keynote address today. I'm speaking to you in my role as Vice Chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as well as my role as Australia's Disability Discrimination Commissioner. I would also like to thank the organisers for their flexibility in response to my inability to travel to Taiwan at this time. It is disappointing that I can't join you in person today, but I look forward to the opportunity to one day visit Taiwan. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, emerged out of the social and political activism of the disability rights movement. From the 1960s, people with disabilities have fought to have greater control of our lives, to challenge segregation, inequality and discrimination. We formed our own organisations and fought for many years for the development of a convention that would reaffirm our human rights on an equal basis with others. Prior to the CRPD, international human rights law had failed to uphold the human rights of people with disabilities. People with disabilities were not considered as an equally valued part of the diversity of the human condition. Rather, they were considered as different and apart from the rest of humanity. Efforts to promote the equalisation of opportunities for people with disabilities through the 1982 World Programme of Action concerning disabled persons had been insufficient, and the complete absence of disability as a specific target or goal of the Millennium Development Goals prompted Mexico to present a resolution for a Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the UN General Assembly in December 2001. There was unprecedented involvement of organisations of people with disabilities during the 5 years of negotiations of the Convention. And in 2006, the Community of Nations committed to the CRPD provisions that respond to the inequality and discrimination, segregation, institutionalisation, social and economic exclusion, and the loss of autonomy experienced by people with disability. This is the ratio legis, or the reason for this piece of international human rights law. The CRPD is based on a contemporary conceptualisation of disability, which has its roots in the political activism of the disability rights movement. The campaign for the disability rights movement was, and still is, a rejection of the medical model of disability. A model that conceptualises disability as a deficit located in the individual, a deviation from bodily, cognitive and mental norms that requires a range of medical and expert interventions to diagnose, treat and cure. Under a medical model, people with disabilities are not seen as meeting the normative standard of what it means to be human, and are viewed as different, as exceptions, as other, requiring care, treatment and protection within social welfare and health regimes as a way of dealing with their so-called special needs. The medical model does not view people with disabilities as rights holders, but they are instead reduced to their impairments. Exclusion and differential treatment are legitimised by a medically driven incapacity approach to disability. The normative standard of the medical model, which conceptualises disability as individual deficit, is now commonly referred to as ableism. At the core of ableism are the power relations that privilege people without disabilities and devalue people with disabilities, and that result in discrimination, inequality and segregation. The ableist normative standard is recognised as being embedded deeply and subliminally within culture. It lies at the foundation of knowledge within cultures across the globe. Ableism, like sexism, racism, ageism, and other hierarchical power relations, is the underlying power dynamic that perpetuates discrimination and inequality. Ableism results in a policy response that legitimises segregation and the denial of personhood and autonomy under the guise of benevolent and benign care, treatment and protection systems. The belief that people with disabilities are incapable of being part of the community becomes self-evident, and the segregation and exclusion of people with disabilities from community life is unquestioned. The CRPD articulates a human rights model of disability, which provides a significant conceptual shift in how we understand and respond to the phenomenon of disability as societies. The human rights model recognises disability as a social construct. It recognises disability as an evolving concept that results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Importantly, the human rights model values impairment as part of human diversity and human dignity. It recognises that people with disabilities are rights holders and can exercise and enjoy their human rights on an equal basis with others. It is centred on the principle of non-discrimination, which establishes that impairment should never be the basis for the denial or diminishment of the enjoyment and exercise of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. The CRPD challenges ableism by reaffirming a human rights approach for people with disabilities. It reframes existing human rights standards by addressing the specific situation of people with disabilities to ensure they enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with others. This requires turning human rights from laws into effective policies, practices, and practical realities. Human rights principles and standards provide guidance about what should be done and emphasise how human rights are achieved. To deliver on the promise of the CRPD, human rights standards and principles have to be translated into practical realities for people with disabilities. The foundational goal of the social transformation required by the CRPD is to reframe and reimagine disability policy. Central to applying a human rights approach are the mutually reinforcing building blocks of the CRPD that are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated with all articles and obligations. This includes, in no priority order, the following. Firstly, equality and non-discrimination. The CRPD reaffirms the principle of equality on an equal basis with others and the legal standard of non-discrimination. People with disabilities are equal in value and worth. For example, legal policy and practice measures that promote and perpetuate segregation on the basis of impairment are prima facie discrimination. Secondly, equal recognition before the law. The CRPD reaffirms that people with disabilities are subjects of rights and can exercise rights on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life. It is central to individual autonomy and personhood and to having agency over one's life. Among other things, law policy and practice reform needs to ensure that supported decision-making is a reality for people with disabilities so they can make their own decisions based on their will and preference. full and effective participation and inclusion in society. The CRPD reinforces that inherent dignity, autonomy, and independence requires universal design of infrastructure, products, environments, programs, and services. There needs to be broad mainstream system reform that facilitates personal autonomy and independence, including through accessible information and technology and digital ecosystems, facilitating the use of sign language, braille, augmentative and alternative communications, accessible transportation and physical environments. Fourthly, recognition of intersectionality. The human rights model of disability acknowledges that disability is one of several layers of identity. People with disabilities do not experience discrimination and inequality as a homogenous group. Intersectional discrimination recognises the multidimensional layers of identities, statuses, and life realities that interact with each other at the same time in such a way as to be inseparable. Here, disability law, policy and practice must respond to and incorporate the diversity of people with disabilities, including in relation to sex, age, race, Indigenous identity and sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and innate variations of sex characteristics, or SOGIESC. Finally, but by no means least, the voice and active participation of people with disabilities. The raison d'etre of the CRPD is the human rights violations that occur because people with disabilities are not afforded a voice in their own lives. Based on the quintessential non-negotiable ingredient of nothing about us without us, the CRPD addresses the exclusion and marginalisation of people with disabilities by requiring their active participation and involvement in all decisions that affect them, including in all aspects of law, policy and practice. The human rights model of disability and a human rights approach are fundamental to implementation of the CRPD. It is within this framework that law, policy and practice should be developed and implemented to realise the social transformation, the promise of the CRPD. This requires positive measures to be taken to dismantle existing systems underpinned by ableism and to facilitate the full and effective participation and inclusion of people with disabilities in society. It is not simply about overcoming barriers to realising rights, but seeking to address ableism, which is the underlying cause of the denial of rights. Children and adults with disabilities can no longer be segregated in institutions, in educational settings and employment, denied their personhood and autonomy through substitute decision-making systems, be subject to harmful practices, coercive treatment and forced medical interventions, be deprived of their liberty on the basis of impairment, experience exploitation, violence and abuse, or experience attitudinal, communication and environmental barriers to all aspects of community life. The body charged with monitoring the implementation of the CRPD is the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities established under the Convention. The committee works within the legal context of its source document, the CRPD, and is guided by the CRPD and its jurisprudence. The committee has observed through its reviews of state party implementation of the CRPD that many states parties continue to view their obligations within the medical model of disability, holding on to established law, policy and practice frameworks that maintain institutionalisation, segregation, deprivation of liberty and substitute decision-making, and continue to deny or diminish the human rights of people with disabilities. This is justified by reference to the need to protect, treat and care for people with disabilities, who are commonly considered to be inherently vulnerable. There are also well-established infrastructure, funding and vested and professional interests in disability, education, mental health, aged care, justice and guardianship service systems that support ableist arrangements. These systems have significant power to influence decision-making, and the status and existing financial arrangements are privileged over the rights of people with disabilities. As a response to the vested interests and lack of understanding of the social transformation required by the CRPD, the committee has developed a significant body of jurisprudence to elaborate on the interpretation of the principles and standards of the Convention. This jurisprudence is unequivocal regarding the universal application of human rights, and that the denial and limitation of rights based on impairment is incompatible with the CRPD. We need to unlearn old systems, relearn new approaches, and build our law and policy frameworks to underpin a new default way of thinking. As René Cassin said during the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it would be deceiving the peoples of the world to let them think that a legal provision was all that was required, when in fact an entire social structure had to be transformed. Embedding a human rights approach to disability requires leadership and commitment to change how we currently do things and to examine what is holding us back from social transformation. The CRPD provides us with a comprehensive roadmap to achieve the social transformation required to end the inequality and discrimination experienced by people with disabilities. This will require embracing the legal and policy standards provided by the CRPD to make the conceptual shift that impairment is a valued part of human diversity and human dignity. That impairment should never be the basis for the denial or diminishment of human rights. That disability is socially constructed and that transformation is required to dismantle the underlying power relations in law, policy and practice frameworks to ensure equality. If our focus remains on fixing or reforming existing systems built on ableism, the necessary social transformation required by the CRPD will not be understood or realised. As the former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Professor Gerard Quinn, eloquently put it, the difficulty of achieving it shouldn't hold us back from committing to beginning that journey wholeheartedly. The journey will require the collective effort of all stakeholders, including governments, policymakers, national human rights institutions, service providers, advocates, and the disability community. I look forward to further discussion today about the CRPD and the rights of persons with disabilities. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner KS, for the very wonderful and insightful presentation. I believe that you, just as me, we are all deeply inspired. Next, I would like to invite KS to be online with us. Is that okay? All right. Okay. So for the time we have 9 minutes. We have 9 minutes for the Q&A session. All right. Maybe we'll take 3 questions, but if you ask questions, please be concise. After the 3 questions, we would then ask Commissioner KS to answer all together. All right? Hello, Commissioner KS. Can you hear us?
Thank you.
All right. Now, I would like to invite our audience to ask questions. Raise your hand if you have any questions. All right. The friend over there. Anyone else? Okay, Professor Zhou. Anyone else? One final question. All right. If no, we'll take 2 questions. All right. Secretary General Hong, please. Or is it Junjie? Or okay, Junjie. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the sharing. I have a simple question. You mentioned that the active participation of persons with disabilities. I want to ask more concretely, how do we go about doing this? Because for persons with disabilities, for us to voice and participate and change the policies, it is very difficult to challenge the status quo, and it's very difficult because of our current conditions. So do you have any suggestions for concrete approaches? Because for us, going outside or letting our voice to be seen or heard by the society or the government agencies alone, based on our current conditions, would face many different obstacles, and even will be deprived of such opportunities. So that's the first question. Next, we will ask Professor Zhou to ask the question. Yes, please. First of all, thank you very much, Commissioner KS, for such a wonderful speech. I have a brief and simple question. So, is human rights issue a cultural issue? Also, based on your Australian experience, how do you deal with the implementation of CRPD and the issues of indigenous peoples? Thank you. All right. Also, Secretary General Hong, please. Commissioner KS, we're very honored that you accepted our invites this time. You mentioned last time that you want to have all the stakeholders to join forces. I want to ask that actually in the past, the promotions of the rights of persons with disabilities were participated by parents and also caregivers. But with the new concept joining in, people started to have different ideas regarding how to treat the persons with disabilities. They're still stakeholders, but they themselves may not necessarily be the persons with disabilities, such as caregivers. How do caregivers change? How should they change their attitude and concept? All right, thank you for the 3 questions. Now we'll ask Commissioner to answer.
Thank you very much for your questions. Firstly, supporting organisations of persons with disabilities is quite central to the obligations of the CRPD. States parties are under an obligation to promote the voices of people with disability and to include them within policy development. So I understand the barriers that people with disabilities experience in engaging in the policy process, but that's the central element of the obligations under 4.3 and Article 29. People with disability have an individual right under Article 29 to form their own organisations and to be able to participate in public and political life. But under Article 4.3, states have an obligation to be able to support those organisations to ensure that people with disability have a voice and that barriers are removed so they can participate in policy processes to ensure that their voices are heard, that they're closely consulted with and actively involved. In terms of the voices of caregivers and families and other actors, yes, that was the experience and can still be the experience in many areas. So again, it's about supporting the voices of people with disability through their own organisations. The general comment 7 on Article 4.3 is quite explicit that it talks about the primary focus should be about organisations of people with disability for people with disability. So organisations of people with disability themselves that are managed by people with disability themselves and governed by people with disability. So it's those member organisations of people with disability that should be prioritised in the policy process. So it truly is the voice of people with disability. Implementation of CRPD is not easy. I see it across the globe that it's not just a cultural thing, it's a systems-wide thing. It is the way our societies have been structured, our built environments, our digital environments. It's not just a cultural issue. It is far more structural and very deeply embedded, and it will take significant transformation to be able to change it, but we need to make the commitment. Otherwise, we end up with significant entrenched vested interests that make it very difficult to change the situation. Implementing CRPD in Australia has not been easy. Australia has an uncomfortable relationship with human rights. We have a strong human rights commission where I work, but we don't have the foundational Human Rights Act that the Commission was established to support and help implement and monitor. The strength of the CRPD is the strength to which states parties incorporated into domestic law. Australia has not incorporated the CRPD into domestic law. It operates under a process of what's called parliamentary sovereignty, so law can only be made by the Australian Parliament. So international instruments need to go through a process of translation through the Australian Parliament to make them justiciable within Australian domestic law. We haven't been through that process. We're currently debating whether we should have a Human Rights Act, which would give us the opportunity to embed CRPD and other human rights, other articulations of fundamental human rights and freedoms into Australian domestic law. But Australia is not alone. The committee sees worldwide not a lot of movement in terms of incorporating CRPD rights and addressing some of the very fundamental human rights violations, such as the violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation that people with disability experience, the segregation and institutionalisation that people with disability experience, and forced treatment regimes and guardianship regimes that deny people with disability their personal autonomy.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Rosemary KS, for this wonderful speech. And also very briefly and very concisely answered all of our questions. We do hope that in the near future, we can have Commissioner KS to Taiwan or East Asian countries and have more interactions and explanations to us all. Also, we noticed that this month, the UN Human Rights Council also passed the proposal proposed by Australia looking at the CRPD monitoring and say that states need to ask National Human Rights Commission to have more obligation and responsibility. And for this part, I think in Taiwan, currently the independent monitoring mechanism of CRPD is also done by National Human Rights Commission of Taiwan, and we believe we will definitely do more in the future. Once again, thank you very much for your time, and I think that's it. This sums up our session. Once again, thank you for your time, and we also would like to welcome you to come to Taiwan in the near future. Thank you. All right. Maybe we'd like to invite some distinguished guests to also take a group photo with Commissioner KS. So please stay on the screen. I would like to invite Secretary General Hong, Commissioner Wang, also Commissioner Ji and Commissioner Ye, Professor Karen Fisher, Professor Dong Suk Lee, and Professor Nakasai Osamu. And also Dean Zhang Henghao and Vice Secretary General Zhang Chaoxiang. Please, let's take a group photo on the stage together.